name is Sarah Omar, and I'm assistant professor in Arabic and Islamic Studies here at Georgetown University. I'd like to welcome you to our series where you get to meet scholars and hear them discuss their intellectual journeys. My guest today is Dr. Juliane Hammer, associate professor at University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. Dr. Hammer, welcome, and thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you. And thank you for the invitation. I'm really honored to be here.
You. So if you can maybe start by just telling us a little bit about yourself and what brought you to your areas of research and study, it would be just a nice opportunity for us to get to know you a little bit better.
So there's a long story and a short story to that. I'll try to stick with the short one. I grew up in Germany, in East Berlin, and actually went to graduate school in Germany at Humboldt University. I have a PhD in Islamic studies, and then came to the US about 4 months after 9/11 in early 2002, which in really interesting and really profound ways has sort of shaped my trajectory as a scholar. I came into Islamic studies with a real fascination with Arabic as a language, which actually goes back to high school, and brought to my studies also activist experience in Palestine solidarity work. So the time I spent in Germany at Humboldt, but between getting a master's and then a PhD, focused in Palestine studies. I spent in all about 2 years in Palestine over the course of my graduate studies, but also developed sort of a broader interest in Muslim practice. So Middle East studies and Islamic studies in Germany are sort of intertwined in a way that they're not in the same way in the US. And I've always had an interest in gender issues. I remember talking to my sister's high school class about feminism when I was 18, 19. And eventually, after I moved to the US, I turned more fully to the study of US Muslims with a focus on gender. I would probably say initially with a focus on women and eventually with a focus on gender. And I can say more about where I'm sort of currently at because that was 19 years ago.
Okay, well, thank you for that. What type of questions, given the scope of your research and how much you've written, what type of questions have you been asking, and what kinds of shifts and changes have happened with those questions as your career has progressed?
Mm-hmm. So this is a really interesting question because I don't think scholars often sort of pause to think about their trajectory in that way. And so thinking about it was actually an interesting experience for me. And what I sort of came up with is that what holds my academic interests together over the past 25 or so years is an interest in activism and an activist, so an interest in people who work to make the world better. I know that sounds a little cheesy, but it is actually not untrue. And with that, an interest in justice and injustice, so notions of justice and injustice within, especially for me, within religious frameworks. And that actually makes it possible for me to explain how I went from Palestine studies. So for my dissertation, for my PhD research, I worked on a study that was looking at ideas of Palestine as a homeland and diaspora communities' experiences, those who could in the late 1990s go back to Palestine, and how they experienced this homeland that they had imagined over a long period of time. And so it's embedded in the history of the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. It's embedded in questions of justice and belonging and nationalism, and has at least aspects of it. We're also interested in questions of religion. So how does being a Palestinian Muslim or a Palestinian Christian inform notions of belonging in Palestine, even as a place, as a physical place? And somewhere in the late 1990s, I became Muslim. And so there's sort of a story that's also connected to my research, and that I can't disentangle it, and I haven't actually tried, even though I was very, very careful initially, especially in disclosing that fact, so that identity. So what it hasn't led to, and that was partly, I think, a choice on my part, is theologically invested scholarship. So I don't actually do very obviously prescriptive work. I would now say that I do certain types of normative work, but they're not religiously normative. So I've spent quite a bit of time since I got tenure writing about normativities in religious studies and normativity that's not religious normativity, but the kinds of frames and ideas, and I don't love the word agendas, but the sort of framing that we bring to our scholarship. For me, one of the important ones is a commitment to justice, especially gender justice, that I guess would make me a feminist. But it's also increasingly a commitment to racial justice. So I have, thinking about change, one thing that has shifted over the years, which was really important for working on American Muslim communities, was the connection between race and gender. And with that, perhaps also issues like anti-Muslim hostility. And so when I look at it, I think what holds it together is sort of these steps towards looking at how people navigate injustice and a world that is not what they think it should be. And from a religious perspective, that's really interesting because it raises really fascinating theological questions about theodicy, about why the world is the way it is and what we're supposed to be doing in it. And activists, religious activists, Muslim activists answer that question in really fascinating ways.
Well, I'm wondering, given the fact that your questions have shifted and maybe even your research interests have shifted a little bit, what type of methods or approaches or even theories that you've relied on, how have those have shifted as you begin and continue to address these questions in a changing areas and changing fields?
Mm-hmm. So methodologically, the shift has not been as dramatic, I would say. I usually describe my methodological approach as a combination of ethnographic and textual work. So in Islamic studies, at least in the US context and more broadly in religious studies, that's still not fully accepted, I would say. So the textual part is probably considered more authentic. But then there's the additional challenge that textual work in Islamic studies and more broadly in religious studies is really only considered authentic if it focuses on the pre-modern period. And I have never actually done that. All my work has been contemporary, basically. And so I have a much broader definition of what counts as a text. So that's an important piece that I look at YouTube videos and blog posts, and not quite yet TikTok, but I will get there with the help of my children. So like a broader understanding of text and an understanding of ethnographic method as an access point to people that is both methodologically fraught with power issues, for example, and with access issues, but an important way to get at lived realities of people and lived practices of people. And so I would say that is one thing that has also shifted in terms of my questions. So I'm interested increasingly in the relationship between discourse and practice. I actually argue in my last book, Peaceful Families, that people don't always have ideas first and then put them into practice, but that their practices can inform their ideas in really profound ways. And so that relationship interests me very much at the moment. And in terms of theory, I would say two things that are important to me. One is a shift from feminist studies and gender theory to gender and sexuality. So which do exist as separate fields in some ways. And I have an increasing interest in questions of sexual diversity, but also sexual practice and questions of sexual violence, because I don't think they can actually be disaggregated from each other. But there's a whole separate theoretical literature to go with that. And the other really important and really big shift that has happened for me is a much more serious engagement with two bodies of literature. One is Black feminist and womanist thought. So primarily the idea that that needs to be incorporated and recognized and engaged with as theory, which is not something that's really established in, at least not in our field. And the other one is a body of sort of decolonial approaches, especially to religious studies, but also connecting decolonial theory with religious studies where that's not actually necessarily happening. And so theoretically, I think I've actually moved in really exciting ways. That's what I find exciting at the moment. And there is, I think, still a part of my work that's really committed to also putting secular feminist theory and not religion generally, but Islam and Muslims into conversation with each other. So I think I have some projects that are more interested in those kinds of questions. So like, what is Islamic studies doing with these kinds of theories? How do we incorporate this into the work that we're doing? How does it change how we look at our topics in our fields? And then there is a set of sort of projects that are more sort of practically oriented that more recently, I've looked more carefully at discourses around sexual diversity in Islam, and which also sort of continues a longstanding question I have about who has religious authority, who decides what the discourse is, who decides what is acceptable. And so it extends certain questions, but it also opens up really new areas that I have ventured into much more recently.
Wow, fascinating. Thank you so much for all of this and for being with us and for your time. Truly such a pleasure to have you.
Thank you so much. As I said, I'm really honored to be part of this pantheon at Georgetown.
Thank you. Thank you.